Okay, let's give it another go. We are still Thursday, the 20th of February. We have hardwired the studio computer into itchy head into the internet instead of just using the Wi-Fi, and we are going to see if that stops the old spinning wheel of death problem. While we're here, I will just share my screen again so you can see what's going on, and we'll put me into a small corner in the corner of the corner. And I've got to tuck that away behind there. And then hopefully I can see the chat. I can see that we're still streaming and all of that. Sort of my little itches and stretches out. Excuse me. Oh, cripes. Okay, so we get my moustache out of my mouth. Let's get some wax or something. I've got some upstairs. Right then, we were in chapter 2 of An Open Creel. That's me just talking away when we were trying to resolve the problem. So this is likely to be... That's right, he was digging for worms, wasn't he? It's down here, I think. Digging for worms. There were, and we hadn't talked about droppers. Hadn't done that. Perhaps it is back here. Let's just go backwards on that. And just see how far we got before we lost. All right, there's 2 years past, so that's where we are there. Okay, years. That's where we go. Okay, so just make sure everything's running as it should be. Yes, it is. Hopefully the beautiful Liz will be by very soon to tell me that everything's working perfectly and we're all hunky-dory. Until then, let's continue with Hugh Tempest Sheringham. Okay. For it, there we go. Yes. Let's get rid of that breath. There we go. For it, I caused to be made a new butt 9 inches long, and so became the possessor of the smallest fly rod in the world, 6 feet 3 inches. This I took up to Yorkshire and displayed with all an inventor's pride, much, I imagine, as one would exhibit the latest triumph in aeroplanes. I had forgotten that science never stands still. It was Maecenas, wasn't it? Let's go back for Maecenas then. When Maecenas, with a genial smile, produced a real rod in 2 joints, not a makeshift like mine, several inches shorter, my feelings became like, I am imagining again, those of the inventor who has just seen his aeroplane descend to Earth unexpectedly. That, however, is by the way, and I must get on to Monday. It was a most curious day. The world was wrapped in a blanket of what seemed half thundercloud, half mountain mist. Not a breath of air stirred the smallest leaf. The heat was intense, and the light was shocking. The weather could not have been more unpropitious for trout fishing, but the beck was in good volume after the recent rains, and one never knows what may happen. So I started off in knee boots and mackintosh, and armed, not just armed, and armed. And armed with a few worms, in case, soon after breakfast. No, that's pacing's wrong. And armed with a few worms, in case, soon after breakfast, being driven to a point about 2 miles down the valley, whence I could drop down the hill to the water, there a good deal less bushed than up above. I put on a 2-yard cast, with a black gnat as tail fly and a blue upright as dropper. Both these alighted on a bush at the first cast over the first little pool and remained there. But I think I had frightened all the trout in it before that. Repairs completed, I scrambled down the steep bank and got into the stream to fish the next pool. Again, all the trout were disturbed before a cast had been... Pool should have sounded like pool and not bool. Yeah, bool. That's no good. That's why I went money. Repairs completed, I scrambled down the steep bank and got into the stream to fish. It was rough as well. Repairs completed, Repairs completed, I scrambled down the steep bank and got into the stream to fish the next pool. Again, all the trout were disturbed before a cast had been made, but in other respects I was more fortunate, the dropper only being lost this time. After this there was a succession of almost open pools for some way, so I was quite economical of flies. But the trout were amazingly shy. It seemed to be quite impossible to get within casting distance of them, even from below. From the tail of each pool as I approached, 2 or 3 fish would dart off upstream, frightening all the rest, as the pools were barely a foot deep and frustrating the most cautious advance. It was some time before the ice was broken by the capture of a 4-inch trout from a stickle more lively than the rest, and I began to think that Gill Beck was not a fishable water at all. And breathe. Then, by a lucky accident, I discovered one of its secrets. I lost both flies in a tree overhead. I shall not dwell on this recurring feature of the day again, but may just mention that the total was 6 black gnats, 3 blue uprights, 2 March browns, 2 red spinners, and 6 or 7 assorted droppers, and had to renew them and half the cast. This I did not while standing, just standing. This I did standing where I was under the tree and with a... This I did standing where I was under the tree and within a cast of the pool above it, in which I had already seen alarms and excursions going on. The repair took some minutes, and then I avoided the tree by an underhand switch cast, and the flies fell just at the tail of the pool. Instantly there was a bold rise, and my first sizable trout came tumbling... not cane. That's where we'll go from the bold rise. Instantly there was a bold rise, and my first sizable trout came tumbling and splashing downstream into the net. It was quite a nice one of 3 ounces. 2 little things were hooked, landed, and returned before I moved, and I had yet more before the pool was finished. Pick it up there. 2 little things were hooked, landed, and returned before I moved, and I had yet more before the pool was finished, turning over a good one in the stream at its head. This revealed a policy which seemed likely to pay, to get into position for each pool, and then to wait for a few minutes until the trout should have got over their alarm. And pay it did, after a modest fashion, for by a belated luncheon time I was possessed of half a dozen trout, averaging about 3 ounces, and very pleased with myself. Besides them, there had been a number of small ones returned, and 1 or 2 interesting experiences. On a sandy glide above a pool, for instance, I became aware of 2 eels, each about half a pound in weight, grubbing amicably about like 2 dogs among rat holes. Then, while I was putting a worm on the tail fly to see whether one of them would take it, the eels suddenly fell out about something and began to fight, worrying each other like the aforesaid dogs. Of the worm they took no notice at all, and one of them finally drove the other into a hole under the bank. I was so engrossed in watching them that I did not perceive a monstrous great trout which had sprung from nowhere and was coming open-mouthed after the worm. I moved suddenly, and he turned tail to my grief, for he was all of 1/4 pound. A little later, while I was repairing damages, tamen usque recurrit. Tamen. No. A little later, while I was repairing damages, tamen usque recurrit, I looked up and saw a large stoat crossing the shallow stream. A little later, while I was repairing damages, tamen usque recurrit, I looked up and saw a large stoat crossing the shallow stream a few yards above me. Here we go. Liz says 10 minutes in and we're still working. We may have fixed the technical problem. Clever, Liz. Thank you. It galloped rather than ran. I cut in on that one, I think. Did I? Yeah. Can you see there? I just dropped in a little bit too early. Let's grab a sip. Okay, here we go. It galloped rather than ran, evidently not much liking the water. Then it disappeared in a hedge which ran down to the stream. Immediately out came a rabbit, which sat and waited to see whether it was pursued. The stoat did not appear, and after a little Bunny crept up to the hedge and peeped through, went a little higher and peeped again, and finally, coming to the conclusion that the coast was clear, disappeared with a joyful flirt of its white scut. It was for all the world like a child playing hide and seek. Soon after this, I had the sport. Hold on, glad you're up and working. She's returning to her edit. You have a lovely edit, my love. I shall return to this, and I'll see you later on. Soon after this, I had the sport of the day in a rather deep pool overhung by a willow and fed by a kind of natural waterfall. 2 trout came at me and were basketed, one from the still water under the bows, and the other from the rough stream at the top, and they weighed just under 5 ounces and 5½ ounces respectively, par nobile fratrum. On the tiny rod and gossamer gut they really made a great fight. They were also the last of the day, for the sky got so dark that I suspected the advent of a heavy storm, and went on upstream without fishing any more. It was just as well I did, for the going was very arduous. Steep banks, ditches, stone walls, cliffs, brushwood barriers, and other things making the heat seem absolutely stifling. It took me more than an hour to cover about 2 miles of ground, now in the beck and now out of it, and the rain began just as I was in sight of home. One thing I noted for the morrow, that for fishing purposes I was obviously on the wrong side. For the day I was well satisfied, having 8 trout, all caught on the black gnat. Tuesday dawned with mist, which soon turned to steady rain, the fulfilment of Monday's sinister promise. But when I started fishing at the same place as before, I found that the beck was a good deal lower, and the fish even shyer. For fully an hour I did nothing at all except get hung up. It is astonishing how on a small stream the most inconsiderable twig sticking out of the water, the tiniest corner of a submerged stone, the solitary overhanging thistle or head of grass will exercise a magnetic attraction for one's flies, to say nothing of bushes, trees, and other real obstacles. Possibly something depends on one's mood. I was discouraged by finding the water so low, and had that should be a run-on. I was discouraged by finding the water so low, and had a presentiment that I should do very little. Then, just above a little bridge, casting round a corner, I got a fish of 2 ounces and felt better. The rain also became heavier and dimpled the surface of the pools, making fishing easier, so I got several more trout in quick succession. The first was on the black gnat, but the others all took a red spinner, which served as a dropper. There was a noticeable difference in the spots where the fish rose on the 2 days. On Monday, they mostly came from the deeper, stiller water, but today they were nearly all in the stickles. The best, a fish of about 5 ounces, was lying in a place where there was barely enough water to cover him, a sharp run entirely surrounded with bushes and only to be covered by a sort of steeple cast, which is a very useful get in there. Which is a very useful thing on these tiny streams. Straightforward casting, indeed, was scarcely possible anywhere after the first half-mile. Steeple, switch, and catapult casts had to be employed, and the shortness of the rod was a decided help. The great thing in this sort of fishing is not to be afraid. You must expect to lose some flies, but a bold policy often makes it possible to cover spots which look quite unapproachable. You have to forget all about the rule of extending line behind, and to treat it as though it were no longer than the rod. Often this forcing method will get it out, even though it is 3 or 4 times as long. I do not know how it is done, but it can be done. I continued to catch fish at intervals till about 4 p.m., and then the beck began to rise, the trout ceased to move, and my luck deserted me. At 4.54, so they don't put the O in. I would say 4:05, I think. At 4:05 p.m. I scrambled up a steep bank and tore a great rent in a new mackintosh. At 4:10 p.m. I climbed over a gate, out of which a nail projected, and did my raiment even more serious damage. At 4:15 p.m. I got in the... there was a nasty whistling F there. At 4:15 p.m. I got in over the top of my left knee boot. A little later I got my cast entangled in a bush and frayed it to ribbons, so I took it off, put on worm tackle, not worn tackle, worm tackle. Come on, get ready. Put on worm tackle and, after catching one more trout, lost that. Then I reached the spot where the day before I had decided that I was on the wrong side of the beck and got across with great labour, only to find that the other side was even more wrong. A high hedge seemed to have grown up in the night, and I could not see the water at all. After that, I went home, a mild way of describing the return, which involved climbing, creeping, slipping, falling, and rending of garments. Incidentally, I knocked down a loose stone wall, or a considerable part of it, and was nearly buried in the debris. There are those who say that fishing is a tame proceeding, but it was a delightful day notwithstanding, and I found on arrival that I had caught no fewer than a dozen. My first 2 days on Gilbeck produced 1 trout, the next 2 20, so I feel that the score is settled. Nice, and that's chapter 2. We will turn that into a chapter. Give it a chapter title, chapter 2. Make sure we save everything off, just to be safe. And then we start getting ready for this. Now, I'm going to take this moment just to make sure that everything is working properly and have a little sip. And then we will push on with Hugh Tempest. Okay. It's actually very restful, this. I rather like it. Okay, here we go. Oh. Need to be on there to tell it to record. Here we go. Chapter 3. Dace Fishing at Isleworth. The angler might travel very much farther and fare very much worse. This... Go again. Chapter 3. Dace Fishing at Isleworth. The angler might travel very much farther and fare very much worse. That is my thought every time I visit Isleworth, fly rod in hand, and it is strange if September, not September, but excuse me. Oh dear. And it is strange if September or October does not find me there at least once in each year. I have made the expedition pretty often now, but the charm of it never fails. It is like nothing that I know in the way of fishing near London. Nowhere else can one feel that one is literally cheating fate out of a few happy hours. When one goes farther afield, to the Colne perhaps at West Drayton, Uxbridge, or Rixmansworth. Alan Rixmansworth. When one goes farther afield, to the Colne perhaps at West Drayton, Uxbridge, or Rickmansworth, there is the sense of an undertaking about it. One is earning the right to enjoyment by dint of railway travelling, by having made arrangements, by being burdened with a landing net and possibly lobworms. One is definitely out for the day. But Isleworth is a simple, unpremeditated sort of matter. At luncheon time, one has a sudden conviction that too much work is telling on one's health, and that an afternoon off is the right medicine. At a glance, the paper tells one that the tide was high at London Bridge at 9:30. A simple calculation proves that, since it is an hour later at Richmond, the Isleworth shallows will begin to be fishable at about 2. A light 10-foot rod, a reel, fly box, and basket take no let's pick it up from there. Okay. A light 10-foot rod, a reel, fly box, and basket take no long time to collect. The rubber knee boots stand ready in their corner. One is equipped and away almost as soon as the idea has been formed. It matters little that the train stops at all stations and that the carriages are primitive almost to archaism. En route for Richmond, these things are just and proper. One likes to see people getting in and out full of business, even if one does not quite understand why anyone living in Gunnersbury should be but Eh, so quintessentially British. Even if one does not quite understand why anyone living in Gunnersbury Even if one does not quite understand why anyone living in Gunnersbury should apparently be in such a hurry, so impatient to get to Kew Gardens and urgent affairs, this does. This does not mar the sense of personal emancipation. Rather, it enhances it by contrast. One could get out at Kew Gardens oneself, by the way, walk down to the towpath and fish up to, not finish. One could get out at Kew Gardens oneself, by the way, walk down to the towpath and fish up to Isleworth, and I have done this once or twice. But I prefer, on the whole, to go on to Richmond now and walk downstream. Richmond has made efforts of late to get into line with the times, but mercifully its fascination will not easily be destroyed. Modernity mellows their Modernity mellows there it is. Modernity mellows there by the side of age better than in almost any place I know. As a matter of fact, one sees little of the town, for almost opposite the station yard is a gate leading to the old deer park. It is about 10 minutes' walk across the park to the towpath, which one strikes just above the lock, and yet 10 minutes more to the church ferry at the bottom of Eyot or Eyot? EYOT. Ayat. 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 Yes, Ayat. Ayat. Let's pick it up from here, I think. There's a gate leading to the old deer park. Yes, I see where you are. Okay. It is about 10 minutes' walk across the park to the towpath, which one strikes just above the lock, and yet 10 minutes more to the church ferry at the bottom of Isleworth Isleworth Ayot. Isleworth Ayot. It is about 10 minutes' walk across the park to the towpath, which one strikes just above the lock, and yet 10 minutes more to the church ferry at the bottom of Isleworth Ayot. Above the lock there are always anglers, but I have never yet seen one of them actually catch anything at the time of my passing. From below it one can see the weir, the only one on the Thames which has not moved in me the desire of trout. At low water, however, it looks as if it ought to hold one or two, and there certainly are trout in the reach, though systematic trout fishing does not seem to go on there. I remember once seeing a big trout feed at the head of the Ayot, but whether he is still in existence I know not. Almost any day at low water, however, below the Ayot there are alarms and excursions to be seen among the dace, which argue fish of prey. Which dace? Which? Yeah, it's the alarms that argue. Which argue fish of fish of prey. Which argue fish of prey of considerable size, trout, probably. Occasionally, too, a trout is caught by a dace fisher, but it is usually a small one. Arrived at the ferry, it is well to cross over and fish on the other side, and the knowing among the habitués make their way down for a third of a mile, or perhaps rather more, to the point where the river is shallowest, just above a slight but recognizable bend in the stream. Here, they say, are the biggest dace, the 6-ounce fish, which, when caught, are to be found at the top in each man's basket, like half-pound trout, not like a half-pound trout. Like half-pound trout in Devonshire. But I should say that there is a fair sprinkling of these big dace all the way down, the difficulty being to catch them. Some men hold by big flies, coachman, black gnats, yellow duns, etc., on number 1 or even number 2 hooks being considered about right, and more than once I have been tempted to the same opinion. Lately, though, it's lately, however. Lately, however, the big fly has not served me well. On my last visit, nothing but a black spider on a triple O hook would do any good. That afternoon also upset another theory, or rather taught me something new. My belief had been that you could catch the Islewood dace in 2 ways, one with the dry or semi-dry fly, in which case the fish usually took it on the drop or half volley, as some authority puts it, or wet and drawn along more or less rapidly under water. For a while they confirmed me in this belief, and I caught several with the dry fly, while I missed a good many in the other way. Then they ceased to come up to it at all, either wet or dry, until I accidentally got a rise in recovering the fly as it floated. This led to experiments, and I found that, by letting the By letting the fly fall dry and then dragging it for a few inches along the surface, I got plenty of rises, and pretty bold ones too. The fish came at it before it had gone 6 inches, or not at all, and for an hour I had quite a brisk bit of sport, so much so that on reaching the ferry I did not hesitate to estimate the number of fish kept as 3 dozen. I was really surprised on counting tails afterwards to find that there were only 12.5. It had seemed. Pick it up there. It had seemed to me that for a time I was catching them as fast as I could. 3 dozen would be a very fair basket for a good day, though takes of 8. Go again. It had seemed to me that for a time I was catching them as fast as I could. 3 dozen would be a very fair basket for a good day, though takes of 8 or 10 dozen are made once in a way. 6 inches is the size limit, and the majority of fish caught are about 7. If your 3 dozen average is if your 3 dozen average. If your 3 dozen average 3 ounces apiece, you have done very well indeed, and if you have 3 or 4 6-ounce fish, you may be proud. There are plenty of these big ones in the water, but they are difficult to tempt. It is worthwhile catching a dish of these little dace, if only for the pleasure of looking at them afterwards. They make a brave, silvery show when laid side by side, and though individually at time of capture they have not the looks of brook trout, collectively Collectively, in the evening, they have the advantage. Brook trout lose their gold, but dace preserve their silver. One good angler informed me, rather apologetically, that he proposed to have his catch to breakfast. No apology was needed, for, bones admitted and extracted, dace are good meat, as good as many trout. But dace are not the whole of Isleworth fishing. There is the daily wonder of the great river shrinking away so that a man can go dry foot, or practically so, along its gravel bed and see only a clear, shallow stream where a few hours back was a deep, turbid flood. There is the awful pleasure of imagining what would happen if one were caught suddenly by the turn of the tide, for one is so low down in the world that it seems well nigh impossible. Oh dear, sentence the size of a long thing. For one is, not for it is. For one is so low down in the world that it seems well nigh impossible to climb up that steep bank through the mud to the grounds of Zion House. There is the wonderful solitude almost within sound of London, a small human figure or so up at the ferry, perhaps, and about the brown-sailed barges at the distant quay. But for the rest, no sign of it. Pick it up for but. But for the rest, no sign of life except a gull or two wheeling round, some rooks exploring the naked riverbed, and the dace dimpling the surface of the quiet stream. Then, when the tide has turned, and may you be not too, tide has turned, and may you not be too far from the ferry when that happens, there is a late tea at the London Apprentice, the quaint old inn near the church. The view from its billiard-room window upstream and down is alone worth the journey. After it, there is the return in the ferry-boat, with a long backward look at the riverside street and the old church beneath their canopy of... pick that up from there. And the old church beneath their canopy of crimson sky, the meditative walk beyond... And the old church beneath their canopy of crimson sky, the meditative walk back along the towpath under the great trees, almost each one sheltering its couple of shy lovers who are making believe that the world is as they would have it be, the crossing of the old green with its circle of fair dwellings, and lastly, the extraordinary blaze of light as one gets to the corner of the green and looks up towards the town. This is a fitting end to a day of impressions that one does not easily forget. And chapter, let's zip this bad boy up, chapter 3. Chapter 3. Let's get everything saved off again. Save all projects. Save the projet. Okay, let's just check in. Nobody on at the moment, but we seem to be still streaming, so we're going to have to run this no matter what, and we'll see how far we get. Chapter 4. The Angler's Temper. Some of the old writers were more diffuse on the mental and moral qualities necessary to successful angling than are the authors of today, perhaps because discussion of those things was then more in fashion. But there is plenty of scope for the modern angler to meditate on such abstract matters as faith, hope, and charity in connection with his pastime, the mutability of things, the why and the how. Philosophical speculation undoubtedly has its place in angling. Most absorbing, perhaps, are the mental processes of the angler in the course of any given day's fishing. Excuse me, there's a lot of burping because there's a lot of sipping. Not a lot you can do about it. Absolutely helps if I know where I am before I go there. His temper, for example, is in itself material for lifelong study. What event or series of events is most trying to it? When lost, how is it recovered? How, in the name of all that is wonderful, does it come about that sometimes it is not lost? What happens to the angler and his fishing when it has been thoroughly lost? Is loss of temper a contagious, not contagious? The angler and his fishing when it has been thoroughly lost. Take him. The angler and his fishing when it has been thoroughly lost. I don't like that. Sounds like. Just sounds a bit. Does it come about that sometimes it is not lost? What happens to the angler and his fishing? Oh, I can see a problem there. Let's get rid of that. Get rid of that as well. Go again. Does it come about that sometimes it is not lost? What happens to the angler and his fishing when it has been thoroughly lost? Is loss of temper, not loss of contemper. Is loss of temper a contagious malady, communicable perhaps through long rows of fishermen in a monster competition? Is an oath sworn in tribulation necessarily binding? One might easily fill a book with questions bearing on this topic, and several other books with answers and commentary, but here they would be out of place, and the subject can only be considered on broad lines. Illustration, too, must of necessity be somewhat limited, since one only possesses one temper, and observation of other people's tempers is hampered by their extreme reticence concerning the same. Very rarely shall you hear a brother angler confess that he is there and then without his temper. Afterwards, perhaps, he will let fall a casual remark to the effect that he momentarily lost patience with the barbed wire, and if you are wise, you will let it go at that. There is no need to recapitulate the things you heard him say. There's no recapitulate the things you heard him say. It's all one phrase. There is no need to recapitulate the things you heard him say. It would not be kind. And besides, next time it may be your turn to need tactful treatment. Barbed wire is no respecter of persons. It has seemed to me sometimes that there is a decided difference between loss of temper and another frame of... that should be one phrase as well. It has seemed to me sometimes that there is a decided difference between loss of temper and another frame of mind which is closely allied to it and might be mistaken for it: despair. The first is commonly the result of small woes, the second of grave misfortunes. Possibly by a cumulative process, a succession of small woes. Nobody wants a small woe. Possibly by a cumulative process, a succession of small woes may amount to grave misfortunes, in which case loss of temper may end in the more dignified emotion. But I am not so sure as to this. Fate has a way of dealing the little blows and big ones with different hands, and of using one hand today and the other tomorrow. On the day of small woes, nothing of any magnitude happens at all. Indeed, the fact amounts to another little woe all by itself. On the other day, you get catastrophes, one after the other, any one of which would be enough to stagger you. You are overwhelmed with tribulation. Yet, such a day is the better of the two. You have at any rate lived through stirring times. Take the day of small troubles, and what does it amount to? To begin with, there is a mean sort of wind, which is neither frankly behind nor boldly before, an underhand wind slinking round corners. You see a trout rising under your own bank. You sit down before him and begin. The first cast has not the strength enough, not the strength enough. The first cast has not strength enough, and the abominable breeze curls the fly back. Into the second cast you put more force to counteract the enemy, which, seeing your intention, stops suddenly. The fly falls with a splosh, and the trout is put down. The next trouble is when the wind gets behind you and makes the fly catch in the rod top at the forward cast. The crack it makes is in itself an exasperation, and wiping grease off the fine gut point which has been in contact with the running line is a horrid process. You fear all things. The point may be weakened by the crack. It will be frayed by the wiping. The grease will not come off. You must put on a new point. You do so, and then 2 casts afterwards the wind plays the same trick again. After this, you get caught up in herbage and have to disentangle the gut laboriously from tough obstructions. It is frayed, and a third point is required. Then you get caught up again. This time you pull, first gently, then viciously. Something breaks, and, a little ashamed of yourself, you go in contrition to look for the fly, which, of course, is not to be found. A new point, new fly, and good resolutions. But the point was not soaked enough, and a few seconds later there is a crack in the air, and you have to repair damages once more. After this, you put your right foot into a hole and the water gets into your boot. Next, you get your first rise and miss the fish. Troubles follow apace on this. More fish are missed. More flies are cracked off in the air or pulled off in the thistles. Trout, which to distant view seemed to be rising fearlessly, are put down by the most stealthy approach. That accomplished but somewhat critical angler, Major X, comes up just as you are about to cover a fish rising under the opposite bank. He watches your struggles against the wind, which has taken this opportunity to veer right round for a while in silence. Then he says, "You want to try the downward cut, like this? Down." I think Major X, we can have some fun. "You want to try the downward cut, like this?" Downward cut. I can do better. It's major. It's probably like that. Yeah, that's probably why. "You want to try the downward cut, like this?" No, he's turned into Winston Churchill. "You want to try the downward cut, like this?" Downward cut? After such a morning as you have been having? The only possible answer is to wind up your line and observe that the cast is too much for you, in a nonchalant tone which implies that, while you could, of course, manage any other on the river, this happens to be your one weak spot. You then invite the Major to try his hand, not without malice, and at the first cast his fly fall first cast, not first cast. And at the first cast his fly falls beautifully and he catches a fish, bringing his score up to a brace and a half. It is too much. With a very cursory farewell, you go off downstream, and as you get over the stile at the bend, you look back and see that the Major is already fast in another. You shake your head gloomily and make up your mind that he is little better than a pot hunter. At the road bridge, whither you have made your way in the hope of a trout from the ripple under the middle arch, more trials are in store for you. A small boy springs up from nowhere to vex your soul by looking over the bridge and informing you that there is a big un down. No, that shouldn't be in a kid's voice. That should be a big un down there. Of course there is. It is always there. It was there before the small boy was born, and you were trying for it then too. It is possible to ignore the small boy, but your casting is erratic and irritable. Then a girl and an then a girl and an athletic young fellow come along, not come up along. Then a girl and an athletic young fellow come along the road and, of course, stop to watch you. She says something of which you can distinguish two words: fishing, patience, and he smiles in a superior manner. Really, the ignorance of folly. Really, the ignorance and folly of people is almost past bearing. You might forgive the girl the injury she is doing you by waving her white sunshade above your fish, but when she insults you as well, you yearn for vengeance. You utter a silent prayer that she may marry that very objectionable young man and be smiled at like... Really, the ignorance and folly of people is almost past bearing. You might forgive the girl the injury she is doing you by waving her white sunshade above your fish, but when she insults you as well, you yearn for vengeance. You utter a silent prayer that she may marry that very objectionable young man and be smiled at like that across the breakfast table. Meanwhile, you go on, doggedly trying to put your fly where you want it, over the nose of the big trout. After many futile efforts, you unexpectedly succeed. There is a rise, a boil, a glimpse of a broad yellow side turning in the water, a momentary thrill from the rod top, and your fly comes back to you. Yes, of course, the point of the hook is gone, knocked off by being dashed against the bridge. You might have known that it would be so. "He's lost him," announces the small boy cheerfully, as one has made... "He's lost him," announces the small boy cheerfully, as one who has made a pleasing discovery. So it goes on all day. So it goes on all day, and towards sunset, when, somewhat refreshed and strengthened by a cup of tea, you are hopefully awaiting the evening rise, a finish is added to the day's proceedings by a blanket of white mist which envelops the river and its banks, effectually putting an end to your fishing. It is difficult to see how the angler can avoid losing his temper after such a day, or how he is to be blamed if he favours the landscape with some observations on the general subject of fishing. In that very amusing book, Folly and Fresh Air, which is not so well known to anglers as it ought to be, Mr. Eden Philpotts has described a day of angling misfortunes. Pick it up from Mr. Oh, no, I don't like that. It isn't right. Let's go back and pick that up from which. Which is not so well known to anglers as it ought to be. Mr. Eden Philpotts has described a day of angling misfortunes, and his heroes summing it up. Yeah, summing. Don't get lazy. and his hero's summing up is worth quoting. I pitched the loathsome rod on the ground, sat down on a tree stump, and let Providence have it hot and strong from a lacerated soul. I said, "What the foul fiend have I done that I should be plagued like this? What crime have I committed? It is monstrous, it is unfair, it is wrong. I've had enough to break my heart 20 times over today, and I won't stand it. I'll go back to town tomorrow and write a book that shall ruin this place. I'll blast the reputation of Dartmoor and everything on Dartmoor. I'll warn sportsmen away and wreck these streams, and if I'm lost hereafter, if I ever fish again for trout, and I'm lost hereafter." That's a good rant. Pick it up there. "And wreck these streams, and I'm lost hereafter if I ever fish again for trout as long as I live." With such small alterations, not alterations, not altercations. "If I ever fish again for trout as long as I live." With such small alterations as should be necessary for geographical accuracy, these moving words might well be committed to memory. It is not given to everyone to find speech for himself when it is sorely needed, and I have known days on which I personally should have been immensely relieved if I could have remembered this admirable combination in its entirety. There is a completeness about it which satisfies one's yearnings. Of course, the most desirable thing in connection with temper is its perpetual safe preservation, but as to infirm human... As to. Okay. Hold on. Here we are. Okay. But as to infirm human anglers, this... That was a bit weird. But as to infirm human anglers, this is a manifest impossibility. One has to be content with something less. I dare to hope that putting the matter into words and speaking one's mind after the manner suggested will not be counted against one overmuch. I can do something better with that. What can we do with that? But as to infirm human anglers, this is a manifest impossibility. One has to be content with something less. I dare to hope that putting the matter in... I dare to hope that putting the matter into words and speaking one's mind after the manner suggested will not be counted against one overmuch. It needs a lift at the end. I dare to hope that putting the matter into words and speaking one's mind after the manner suggested will not be counted against one overmuch. No, I'm killing it. I'm losing the end of it. We can do something with that. I dare to hope that putting the matter into words and speaking one's mind after the manner suggested will not be counted against one overmuch. Almost. We're getting there. I dare to hope that putting the matter into words and speaking one's mind after the manner suggested will not be counted against one overmuch. That'll do. No, it won't do. Get it right. I dare to hope that putting the matter into words and speaking one's mind after the manner suggested will not be counted against one overmuch. No, but it's better. The placing's better. I dare to hope that putting the matter into words and speaking one's mind after the manner suggested will not be counted against one overmuch. Better, place. I dare to hope that putting the matter into words, not into the words. I dare to hope that putting the matter into words and speaking one's mind after the manner suggested will not be counted against one overmuch. That's better. Got to land, the last bit. Let's let us turn that into a chapter. Chapter 4. Pink. File, save. Cool. Right then, I'm going to... Let's keep going. Yeah, let's keep going. That's all saved off. Checking in up there, no problems. So we've done an hour now. And we think we've worked out how to not have the signal dropping out. Hard wiring, people. Now, the webcam / phone did something a bit weird earlier on. So let's see if we can make sure we've got plenty of power there. Plenty of power. Okay. The Kennet runs through Reading. The Kennet is our next chapter. Okay. Here we go then. Oh, hello. Don't want to record over chapter 4. Bit of a stretch. Yeah. Okay, here we go. Chapter 5. Some Kennet Days. Is it some Kennet Days or some Kennet Days? I think it's some Kennet Days. Because it's the river that's important. Chapter 5. Some Kennet Days. Of all the South Country streams which I have fished, I think my warmest affections are given to the Kennet. This is not so much on account of the sport which it has given me. This is not so much on account of the sport which it has given me as of the sport which it might some day yield. The Kennet in the first week of June holds one almost breathless with exciting promises, and its trout, in the lower parts, are surely the largest offered for capture by any river that gives the fly fisher a chance. As yet, no Kennet monster has come my way, but the fact that I know by sight several fish verging on 10 pounds is enough to keep me expectant every succeeding mayfly season. To me also it is an attraction that the river is not purely a trout water. Grayling, chub, dace, perch, roach and pike all have their fascination, especially when one knows that all run big. I have an ear thing in to... Yeah, it helped. Yeah. I'm going deaf. And so I can either turn my headphones up higher and exacerbate the deafness, or I can put an ear, what do you call them? Earplug. Put an earplug in, and then I can kind of hear the resonances in my head a little bit better. If any of you are singers, you know that if you put your finger in your ear, if there's a lot of noise around you, you can hear your own voice better, and that's what that's doing. And it just fell out. Naughty thing. Here we go. I should say that the collector of specimens would have a better chance of getting trophies from the Kennet than from any river, except, perhaps, the Hampshire Avon, but he would need patience and luck as well as skill. It is not on every day that the fish can be got to feed. I have fished the river for a good many years now without often getting any sport worth mentioning, but I have had occasional days to be marked with a white stone. 3 of them in particular, all enjoyed on the same fishery, which lies midway between Hungerford and Newbury, have induced deep gratitude in a mind not unduly spoilt by good. 3 of them in particular, all enjoyed on the same fishery, which lies midway between Hungerford and Newbury, have induced deep gratitude in a mind not unduly spoilt by good fortune. The first came opportunely after very trying times of... But no, this chapter is triumphant. It was a windy, sunny day in August when I reached the little cart bridge which spans the water in the middle of the fishery. My mind was set on dace, fish for which this part of the Kennet is famous, and a fly rod was in my hand. Ambition held me in its clutches. A dace weighing a pound or more was its object. Such dace in most rivers are inconceivable, but here they were a possibility. They had been caught in the past, so why should they not also brighten the future? Besides dace, there were grayling to be thought of, and it was, indeed, grayling which insisted on notice first. Above the bridge is a shallow, a perfectly clear stretch of gravel, on which almost every fish is visible 30 yards away or more. The 3 big trout which occasionally come out from under the bridge and cruise round were not there, but one long, dark shape in the middle of the river, 25 yards off, attracted attention. At first I thought it might be one of the 3, but after making out several other rather smaller shapes near it, I came to the conclusion that it must be a grayling, and a big one. Having waders on, I decided to get in behind the shoal and attack them with a short line. The water was deep. Not rather deeper, it's just the water was deeper. The water was deeper than it looked, and when I got to within about 4 yards of the fish, it was nearly up to the top of the waders. This, however, was an advantage in one respect. The grayling took no alarm at my proximity, and I was able to watch their every movement, except when the violent upstream wind ruffled the water too much. There were about a dozen in the shoal, ranging from some 3/4 of a pound up to the big one, who looked a good 2½ pounds. I began the attack with a 00 double-hooked Wickham. The big one tilted his head at it once, and none of the others would look at it. Then it was changed for a little fly with red quill body and badger hackle, also on double hooks. The patriarch came right up to inspect this, as did 2 or 3 others, but all shook their heads and tails and went down again. After several casts, I tried letting the fly sink and float down under water. I could not see it now, but I could see the fish coming up to look at it in just the same way. At last, it seemed to me that one of them opened his mouth and shut it again. I tightened. The grayling turned in the water and was on. Playing him gently downstream, I retreated backwards and eventually got him into the Nent? What the fuck's a... Oh, sorry, I can't say that. What the pum's a nent? Can't use bad words. I've thrown myself that. Must not swear. This is going to be really hard. There he is. And eventually got him to... that's a snatch breath. Let's get rid of that snatch breath. Retreated backwards, and eventually got him into the net and to the bank without disturbing the others. A pounder with a beautiful sheen of salmon pink over his silver. After he had been placed in the creel on a bed of grass, the attack was resumed. But the little fly had lost its attractions and was changed for a Brunton's fancy on a... Brunton's fancy. I love these things. And was changed for a Brunton's fancy on a 00 single hook. This brought the big grayling up like a shot, and I made sure that he meant to have it. But no, down he went again after a perceptible moment of indecision. At the next cast he did have it fairly, but somehow the strike missed him, and he went down again unpricked. The other grayling would not take it, though several of them came and inspected it. Then I suffered it to sink and tried it under water. Again the big fish took it, and again I missed him. With another I had better luck, and after a brisk fight got him to the bank. 1 pound 6 ounces. But I could not get a third, though the fish, one or other of them, would inspect the fly every time it came down. Also, the wind got worse, and it was more difficult to see what was going on. At last I gave it up and went down to the shallow below the bridge, where I knew another shoal had its home. Here the wind was very bad, and I could not see the fish at all, though an occasional rise showed me where they were. Fished dry, Brunton's fancy produced 3 short rises, and fished wet, accidentally one fish. I can take no credit for him, as I found he was on when I attempted to recover the line. Though he was no bigger than the first, he gave a splendid fight, and was netted with difficulty as the fly came away. Lovely, love all the fly names, they're so cool. Okay. Here we go. After this, the wind got worse and worse, and I gave up grayling fishing as a bad job. A worm, used on Stuart tackle in a hole at the bottom of the fishery on the chance of a perch, would be less of a tax on the temper, and scarcely less remunerative than the dry fly. So after lunch, I sat waiting for the perch to begin for pretty well 3 hours. One bite only rewarded my patience, and a gleam of silver as the light fly rod bent to the strike showed that the biter was no perch. It proved to be a beautiful dace, which brought the spring balance fairly down to the £1 mark. Spring balance, not spring balance, it's spring balance. Which brought the spring balance fairly down to the £1 mark. Such a reward was worth all the patience of waiting. At last, as no more bites came, and as the wind was decreasing a little, I put on the fly cast again, and began to fish under the other bank, where surprised by a burp. I'll pick that up from there. And began to fish under the other bank, where I had seen an occasional ring. It proved that there was a shoal of dace there, and for nearly an hour I wasted excellent opportunities. The wind was still gusty and unpleasant, blowing right in my teeth, and 3 casts out of 4 were futile. The 4th usually got a rise, and I usually missed the fish, or pricked and lost him. I finished about 6 p.m. with 6 dace, running from 10 ounces to 13 ounces, whereas I ought to have had at least twice as many. There still remained one more incident of the day, and that was the most important. I was strolling homewards, thinking all was over, as it had turned very cold, when I saw a rise on a shallow outside some rushes. I cast idly at it, and hooked the fish. Imagining that it must be a little one, I essayed to haul it ashore, but it would not be hauled, and went off downstream. Then it rolled, and I saw its depth of silver. With a gasp, I changed my tactics and played it with the most. With a gasp, I changed my tactics and played it with the most anxious care. I confess that I did not deserve the fortune, but the fish was safely landed, a noble dace of £1 2½ ounces. I do not expect ever to get one bigger, and I am thankful to say that, with the other pounder, he reached the taxidermist safely. To get with the, I know it's got 2 of them in a case. Okay, thank you, media item. Pick it up from there. And I am thankful to say that, with the other pounder, he reached the taxidermist safely. Together in a glass case, they now remain a memorial of a glorious occasion. The next day may just be mentioned. Modern trying to go. The next day may just be mentioned as a curiosity. The fishing was you need to get the crap in before that. Change of location. And I need to stop talking and concentrate. The next day may just be mentioned as a curiosity. The fishing was a brief affair, or rather the sport was. I reached the water about 10 a.m. By 20 minutes past I had landed the big grayling and 2 of his brothers, and, except for 3 or 4 little dace, I did not get another fish all day. The big grayling seriously disappointed me when I got him onto the It's only a fish. Why did he disappoint you? The big grayling seriously disappointed me when I got him onto the spring balance, as he just failed to touch the 2-pound mark. But in the water, he was all that fancy. On the water, but in the water, he was all that fancy penny. But in the water, he was all that fancy painted. On 5x gut and a lissom 6-ounce rod, he gave magnificent sport, and it must have been nearly 5 minutes before he was in the net. There was one moment of the combat when he was within 2 yards of the bridge, and I was holding at all risks, in which I credited him with 3 pounds. To me, grayling always look bigger in the water than they are, whereas trout generally seem smaller. But I was glad to get him, though he was below the estimate. He took, as did the others, Brunton's fancy fished wet in the manner described. There is no better grayling fly, and I do not think there is a better way of using it, where one can get behind one's fish and watch them. Unless the fish is in sight, a rise under water in sluggish streams is very difficult to detect. One can seldom feel it as one can in a One can seldom feel it as one can in a quick stream. When the line is seen to stop, it is usually too late to strike. The second Whitestone day I owe to my good friend Hyandry. He gives people names so that he doesn't... Hyandry. I know that's because I've used a Q instead of an A. Just go away for Google for a minute, please. Thank you. How do you... So there's lots of people called. Okay, Andrew. He tends to use classical literature, doesn't he? No. Is it somebody Greek, possibly? This might be one I have to ask Liz to deal with in the proof. Pronunciation. I don't tend to trust pronunciations because anybody can put something on the internet. That's Hyundai, but that doesn't help me. Doesn't help me, mate, does it? It's no use at all. That's not even the right one. Okay, I will put a placeholder in and we will crack on. The second way... Oh, no, way too long. Copy in there. The second Whitestone day I owe to my good friend Hyandry. The story which he related to me was frankly incredible, and I told him so. He had, he asserted, visited the fishery on Easter Monday and had the remarkable experience of finding the big kennet trout rising wholeheartedly at small flies, olives, and trifles of that sort. He hooked, he said, no less than 4 of the real old stagers, besides the smaller fry of about £1, which do not really count as kennet fish. I knew all about those trout, for in the year when I got the big dace I fished for them assiduously and convinced myself that, except during the mayfly season, the big ones would rise at nothing whatsoever, unless it might be at great sedges in the twilight of the long summer evenings. Glasses are slipping down. Itchy nose, glasses. Pop up here. Even while the mayfly was on, my efforts among the monsters were conspicuously unsuccessful. A fish of about 2.5 pounds was the biggest I was able to secure. I had indeed seen fish heavier. much heavier, but they mostly stood on their heads and waved their tails in the air, supremely indifferent to surface food and dry fly anglers alike. My season on the fishery made me profoundly sceptical as to its uses as a dry fly water, except during the first half of June. Therefore, when High and Dry told tales of 3-pounders feeding steadily on olives in April, I said that I should much like to see those marvels for myself. Or, in other words, that he lied. He had, moreover, had reverses, a circumstance which often stimulates incredulity. One monster, for example, ran with super piscine, piscine, piscine? Piscine, isn't it? Of course it is. That said incredulity. Incredulity is the word. Let's go back a little bit further. He had more. It's too long. Okay, now. Reverses. Oh, reverses. Yeah, He had, moreover, had reverses, a circumstance which. He had, moreover, had reverses, a circumstance which often stimulates incredulity. One monster, for example, ran with I'm thinking about piscine. One monster, for example, ran with piscine. Is it piscine? Let's go and come on, don't mess around. Let's get it right. It helps if you put a gap in there. Piscine or piscine? Show me. I don't want to see it on there. I want to see it in a definition. Piscine or piscine, but that's Merriam-Webster. Collins. Have faith in the Collins. Thank you, Collins. I accept. Piscine. I'm going to double check with them. I'm getting piscine. Yeah, there we go. Piscine it is. Okay. Okay, so that is where we want to go from into that. One monster, for example, ran with super piscine swiftness downstream, doubled, jumped, and got off. Another reversed these tactics, making upstream to begin with, but equally getting off. A third, I forget what it did, but it looked like a 5-pounder and got off. The fourth, and here we come to the curious part of the story, did not get off. It was played with consummate skill. High and Dry knows his business. He has not captured vast sea, has he not? High and Dry knows his business. Has he not captured vast sea trout with the dry fly, landed and brought home in triumph? It weighed 2 pounds, 14 ounces, and was seen by credible persons. This fact certainly lent some colour to my friend's assertions. There he could demonstrate with calm simplicity was the fish. On second thoughts, I had to retract what I had said about not believing him, and to admit that what he said had happened had in effect happened. But, I urged, he had stumbled on that unique occasion which is called once in a blue moon. Never, never would he come upon the like again. High and Dry admitted that this might be so, did not profess to explain the phenomena, and thereafter kept silence. But though silent, he was not idle, and to his good offices I attribute an invitation which reached me for a day on the water during the next weekend, a day in which I might be able to see whether Bank Holiday had been exceptional or not, and to find out whether the big trout in that part of the Kennet do take small fly in April, otherwise than once in a blue moon. I could not have had a pleasanter day for the investigation. Warm, with a soft westerly breeze just strong enough to help in a long cast, and with an April shower or so, with an April shower or so, and with an April shower or so to suit the season. The water when about... no, I want that back. The water when is where I want to pick it up. The water, when, at about 9 a.m., I stood on the well-remembered wooden bridge, gazing down the long, bright shallow, looked clear and delightful, while the birds, for which the estate is famous, sang lustily, as on such a day they should. Altogether, it was vastly satisfactory to be abroad, whether the big trout rose or whether they did not, and I blessed my friend for procuring. Rose or whether they did not, and I blessed my friend for procuring the chance for me. Then I saw a fly, a medium olive, and soon afterwards I became aware of rises some little way downstream, also of commotions. Hurrying down to look, I found that the rises were due to several small trout, the commotions to big grayling, which had evidently... It's just two thoughts there. Hurrying down to look, I found that the rises were due to several small trout, the commotions to big grayling, which had evidently just spawned or were about to spawn. No trout of consequence, so far as I could see, was on the move, but the hatch of fly was only just beginning. In any case, I was not minded to stay by the shallow, but to go down to the bottom of the water to a favourite spot of mine of old, where I had been much tantalized by the sight of big trout, generally tailing, sometimes minnowing, but never rising, even in the mayfly time. For some reason, very few mayflies hatched at this point, never enough to make the trout rise, though higher up the hatch might be very great. I covered the half-mile quickly, but not too soon, for the hatch was in full swing when I got to the weed rack, which is almost at the bottom of the water. And not only was fly coming down, fish were coming up under the camp sheathing opposite. One in particular attracted my eye, and as I watched it, I mentally grovelled before High and Dry. What he had said was absolutely true, and here were the big kennet fish doing it again. It was not even a case of a blue moon. I then became excited and nervous. I am not accustomed to seeing big fish feeding like that in April. Moreover, the place was the last but one in the world which one would choose for an encounter with anything over a pound on such tackle as one employs for small dry flies. The river is about 20 yards broad. The weed rack, a pretty solid structure of piles and wire, known as the stop, is shaped like a wedge, with its point upstream and in the middle of the river, and so its sides slope away to the banks, forming acute angles with the camp sheathing. A fish hooked anywhere near the rack is morally certain to run down into the angle and there to destroy the tackle at leisure. First word. Okay, there we go. In fact, I discovered that such a misfortune had happened to an angler the day before, and that he had lost both fly and trout. Conscious of the difficulties of the place, but more conscious of the trout feeding, I began excitedly. He was rising, only a little above the point of the weed rack, and I had to cast slightly downstream to cover him without drag. The first fly was a medium olive quill on a double O-hook, and he bulged at it twice. Then he took it, and, horror, I felt that he was pricked and missed entirely by my own fault, for I struck too soon. That went a bit meh. Don't like that. Let's go back to here. Where is it? The first fly was a medium olive quill on a double O hook, and he bulged at it twice. Then he took it, and, horror, I felt that he was pricked and missed, entirely by my own fault, for I struck too soon. I could have kicked myself, and was abusing my folly, when up... Folly... It's no good. I could have kicked myself, and was abusing my folly, when up he came again as eager as ever. A change of fly might still save the situation. This time it was a medium olive dun on an O hook, and he took it fair and square the first time it came over him. I now realized to the full nature of the place, for he went irresistibly downstream, while I hurried up to get the line clear of the posts. Between us we made the reel scream, and I was sure that I should never see the fish any closer. But mercifully a memory came to me of previous fights in which guile had triumphed over force. Instead of trying to hold the fish, I slackened pressure until the line was no more than a light rein on him, and he stopped within a foot of the lowest post, and began to think it over. It took a longish time, but foot by foot he was coaxed upstream until he was clear of the weed rack altogether, and was swimming meditatively about in front of me. Then something, perhaps the sight of the net which I was getting ready, started him off again, and he once more went helter-skelter for the weed rack, this time in the angle at my own side. Here matters were complicated by a wire stretched across from the bank to the post in the middle of the river. Breathe. This prevented my following, so the fight was all to begin over again. A repetition of the coaxing tactics was ultimately successful, and in the end he came to the net and was mine own. The spring balance made him out 3.5 pounds, a long, thin fish which ought to have weighed quite 4 pounds. But I was not disposed to be critical. A fish of that size had not often come my way to the dry fly. In April, never. 2 other trout fed within a few yards of where the first was hooked. One rose, was missed, and went down. The other was in a quite inaccessible place in the farthest corner of the angle, the one spot in the world worse than that of my fight. To reach it, one had to cast over the side of the weed rack, with the certain knowledge that breaking was inevitable if the fish was hooked. I left a fly in the weed rack and gave it up, yielding the fish to a brother angler who had just arrived. I thought mine had been a pretty good fight, but it pales into insignificance beside the one he had afterwards, for, casting over the piles and wire, he hooked the trout. It ran upstream for a wonder, and he had hopes. Wonder, that's what it says. It ran upstream for a wonder, and he had hopes, but his line caught on one of the posts, and he could not get it clear. After waiting some time, with the fish tugging away 30 yards upstream, he decided on a desperate remedy. 25 yards, no. 25 yards below the reed rack. Hold on. 25 yards below the weed rack is a railway bridge. Paying off line, he retreated to the bridge, climbed up onto it, and, getting a straight pull, freed his line. And then the fish, now some 70 yards above him and still going strong, gave a plunge, and the fly came away. It was a mighty contest, and about the last event of the day, for the hatch of the fly was over by 11, and the big fish all retired. And the big fish all retired. But High and Dry was right. Personally, I am very glad of it. The third great day was vouchsafed... The third great day was vouchsafed to me in the following August, when I was again privileged to visit the water. It was very hot, so hot that I found myself wishing for coolness so early as 8 o'clock. I had been out since before 6, curious to see whether there would in real summer be an early morning rise. There was not, and clearly there would be none till the late evening when the sedges came out. On the way back to breakfast, I threw out a suggestion to the keeper about worms and perch at the stop. The stop is the rather complicated affair for catching weeds described earlier, and is built of wire and piles. Round about it is the deepest water in the fishery, and round about it too were, I had been told, perch and, this I knew from ocular proof, roach. My notion was to sit there, as on previous occasions, unsuccessful of course, but placid and relatively cool. The keeper was doubtful about the perch, but optimistic about worms. No gentleman had left any behind for the public good, but he dared say he could find some himself. Thereupon I went in to breakfast, reflecting that, with the worms that he would dig, the bread that should be levied from the table, and the caddises that I would collect from a ditch, the bait problem was solved. For the tackle, I had my light 10-foot fly rod, reel and gut, and friend C, who has more gear of all kinds than anyone else on earth. Who has more gear of all kinds than anyone else on earth, would surely lend me hooks and lead. This he did, and I started out again after breakfast, possessed of 3 roach hooks and some lead wire. It is a longish tramp to the stop, especially if one goes by way of the ditch, and when I got there I was both heated and caddiseless. Not one caddis had I been... Not one caddis had I been able to find, so all was up with the roach fishing. Though I had duly acquired bread, I knew from experience that the roach in that water will not take it at all in August, probably from unfamiliarity with it. A course of ground baiting might educate them. There remained, therefore, but the worms and perch. Presently, after manoeuvring the punt, providentially left there by the weed cutters, to the position I wanted, I rigged up the tackle, a cast tapering to 3x with a bit of lead wire wrapped around it and one of the roach hooks at the end, and then I opened the worm tin. There is room for a treatise on angleworms, as the Americans call them, and one of its chapters should be entitled Worms and the Lay Mind. The angler asks for worms. The word worms has to him a special significance. The word worms has to him a special significance. It implies good measure, brimming over, a supply large enough to serve the hook all day, and to meet besides the necessities of occasional moderate ground baiting, just to keep the fish alert. The lay mind, on the other hand, interprets it to mean 3 worms and a large white grub, thrown in with the idea that any old thing is, piscatorially considered, a worm. I found my tin slightly better furnished. 3 small lobs, 5 assorted worms of the smallest size, and 1 fragment, but the supply was little enough for a morning's fishing, supposing the perch to be there and in the mood. For a time it looked as though even this meagre stock would be too much. The stop, as has been said, has 2 arms forming a wedge upstream. The punt, tied to the top post, lay along the right arm, and I fished over the posts in the V on the downstream side. The worm lay on the bottom in about 6 feet of water. Nothing happened, so after a time I began to draw it about and fish all the clear water within reach. Not very much, because the weeds were thick below, in the sink and draw fashion attractive to perch. Still nothing happened, but at last there came a striped shadow just as I was about to lift the worm out. I checked my hand, and he had it at once, and was presently lost to sight and burrowing among the posts and driftweed, apparently right under the punt. A steady strain brought him out, but he bolted back 2 or 3 times before the net could come into action. At last it got him, however, an honest pounder, and the worm, blown up in the gut, was still intact. After another spell of inaction, I dropped the worm in upstream of the stop, beyond the other arm, so that the rod point projected over both rows of posts. Some care had to be exercised that the strongish current might not sweep the hook into the posts and cause disaster. Soon I felt a slow, dragging sort of bite, struck, and was battling with another fish for a similar taste for wither, not fora. And was battling with another fish with a similar taste for weeds and posts. It was some minutes before I even saw it, and all I could do was hold on. The lissom fly rod helped as it played to the fish's movements, and so saved the light gut from a smash. At last the fish was coaxed away from the piles, worked upstream, and eventually netted, a roach of 1½ pounds, which proved to be hooked in a fin and not in the mouth. Soon afterwards, in the same place, something else was hooked, which at once bolted through the which at once bolted. Which at once bolted through the far arm of the stop, between 2 posts and under the wire, and plunged into the near arm at my feet, where it remained immovable. I could do nothing but hang on and trust to luck, since the wire was between me and the rod point and the line beneath it. At last the fish yielded to the strain and came out, now visible as a fine perch, and not a trout, as I had at first feared. Executing a strategic movement with the net, I got him just as he was meditating a turn round one of the posts. 1½ pounds. The fine gut was now frayed pretty well to tatters, so I put on a rather stronger cast, stripping a fly to serve as a hook, and tried forcible restraint with the next fish. The light 7-ounce rod was bent nearly double, but the perch never got into danger, and was netted. Another pounder. Then came a fourth, a little heavier, and afterwards I hooked a bigger one. It followed the instant strain quietly enough till it was clear of the obstructions, but then it realized its situation and dashed down on my side of the stop and under the punt, dragging the rod point deep into the water. I have seldom had such a fight, even with a trout, and more than once I feared for the rod. It was a relief when, at last, the meshes of the net received what I felt sure was a 2½ pounder. As a matter of fact, it was just short of 2 pounds. This fish had exhausted the last of the worms, so perch fishing seemed at an end. But a peep into the interior of the punt well revealed 3 minnows left there by some other angler. One of these tempted a last fish to my basket, a 3/4 pounder, and the smallest of the 3 brace. That was the end of it. I made an effort to catch sundry large roach which occasionally swam into view, but, beyond 2 nibbles at a bit of silkweed, got no response, and eventually departed for a very late luncheon with my 7 fish, weighing nearly 10 pounds. Such a basket does not often come my way in these hard times. But the day was not yet over, and more pleasure was in reserve. About 6 p.m. I wandered out again, armed with my biggest fly rod, a powerful split cane of 11 feet 3 inches, and ready for the evening rise. It did not begin till after 8, and then the big trout began to rove about, making great waves on the shallows. But they only came up once or twice apiece, and in the splashy way which does not mean business. One splash, however, was close to my own bank, in a likely corner, and I waited below the spot in case the fish should come on to rise properly. In due course, he did so. After trying several patterns, I got a plug that right in again. After trying several patterns, I got a head and tail riser to sedge, and then we raced downstream together for quite 150 yards, with intervals of leaps and cross rushes on the fish's part. With the exception of one big fish at Blagdon, I have never had a trout on which was so suggestive of a With the exception of one big fish at Blagdon, I have never had a trout on which was so suggestive of a wild salmon. The failing light and powerful rod helped the illusion. When eventually he was out on the bank, it tried. Event, When eventually he was out and on the bank, it transpired that he, like the roach of the morning, was hooked in the pectoral fin. He weighed 3 pounds 6 ounces and made a grand finish to what, in the circumstances, I shall always regard as one of the most delightful days I have ever had. Perfect. We will pop in there. Chapter 5. Chapter 5. Get rid of that. Let's save it off. Okay. So that's the end of today's live. I will be back tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon, 1 in the afternoon GMT, and we'll probably be carrying on with an open creel, unless something else comes through, but there's a few things on the go. If you've watched this far, thank you. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Come and see me all the time. I shall be on here, generally speaking, at 1 p.m. GMT, or British summertime, whichever that is, wherever it is you are in the world. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye.